Today, we're going to dive into something pretty intense, the incredible ways our minds and bodies react when we're faced with overwhelming stress. We'll look at everything from that instant jolt of panic to the really complex, sometimes hidden ways we cope long after the fact. So, let's get right into it.
Of course you have, right? That sudden, all-consuming physical reaction you get when you're scared, that's not just in your head. It's a real, deeply wired biological response. It's an ancient survival mechanism that just kicks into gear whenever you even think you're in danger. And this whole thing has a name you've probably heard before, the fight or flight response. The best way to think about it is like your body's built-in emergency alarm system. The moment your brain's hypothalamus senses danger, it doesn't stop to ask questions. It just pulls the fire alarm, getting you ready to either stand your ground or get the heck out of there. So, how does this alarm actually work? It's not as simple as flipping a single switch. It's actually a really sophisticated two-part process that floods your system with everything it needs to take immediate action. Okay, so it happens in two ways. First, you've got the sympathetic nervous system. This is the fast one. It gives you that instant jolt. Your heart starts racing, your pupils get huge, that's the immediate rush. But at the exact same time, a second, slower system gets going. It's called the HPA pathway, and it starts releasing stress hormones, like cortisol, that keep you on high alert for much longer. It's this brilliant one-two punch designed to keep you alive.
Now, this system is designed to shut itself off once the danger's gone, but what if it doesn't? For some people, after a really traumatic event, that switch gets jammed. The alarm just keeps blaring long after the threat is over. And that's when a normal, healthy stress response can turn into a serious disorder.
And this leads us to the conditions that can pop up when the mind and body just can't move on from a traumatic event. We're talking about acute stress disorder and its more well-known cousin, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD.
So what's the difference between the two? Honestly, it all comes down to the calendar. The symptoms are almost identical, but the timeline is what really matters. If the symptoms show up and then go away in less than a month, it's considered acute stress disorder. But if they stick around for more than a month, and sometimes for years, that's when it becomes PTSD. In fact, an incredible 80% of PTSD cases actually start out as acute stress disorder first.
So what are these symptoms we're talking about? Well, they usually fall into four main buckets. First, there's re-experiencing, which is when the trauma feels like it's happening all over again through things like flashbacks or nightmares. Second is avoidance, doing absolutely anything to stay away from reminders of what happened. Third is reduced responsiveness, where you might feel emotionally numb or just totally detached from everything. And finally, there's increased arousal, which means you're constantly on edge, irritable, and hyper-aware of your surroundings.
And when you look at who develops these disorders, the data shows a really stark difference. After a traumatic event, women are more than twice as likely as men to develop a stress disorder. We're talking about 20% of women compared to just 8% of men. Your socioeconomic status also plays a part, it turns out. People with lower incomes are about twice as likely to be affected.
And it's really important to be clear here. We're not talking about everyday stress. The triggers for these kinds of disorders are incredibly severe events. Things like the horrors of combat, the absolute devastation of a natural disaster, or the deeply personal violation of abuse or assault.
But that fight or flight response, being stuck in that on position, that isn't the only way the mind tries to cope with something unbearable. Sometimes, when reality is just too painful, the mind finds another way out. It doesn't fight, it escapes. This brings us to a whole other category of conditions related to trauma, the dissociative disorders. In these cases, the mind's main defense isn't to fight or to run, but to actually fracture its own sense of self as a way to protect from unimaginable pain.
At the heart of these disorders is something called dissociation, basically a separation from yourself. It's when fundamental parts of who you are, your memories, your identity, become sort of walled off from the rest of your consciousness. It's a pretty radical defense mechanism against overwhelming psychological pain.
The most common way this shows up is in something called dissociative amnesia. Now, this isn't just like forgetting where you put your keys. This is a major loss of memory, almost always centered around a deeply traumatic event. The mind literally just blocks out a chunk of its own history to protect itself.
And then you have the most famous and probably most misunderstood of these disorders, dissociative identity disorder, or DID. You might have heard it called multiple personality disorder before. This is where the mind's escape is so extreme that it actually develops entirely separate identities, often called subpersonalities, as a way to box up the trauma. And the differences between these subpersonalities can be absolutely mind-blowing. This isn't just about mood swings. We're talking different names, different ages, genders, even different racial identities or family histories. One personality might know how to drive a car while another doesn't. But here's the part that is just wild, and it really shows you how deep this split goes. They can have different physiological responses. Things like different blood pressure levels or even different allergies. It's incredible.
So how in the world does something this complex even happen? Well, there are a few leading theories. The psychodynamic view thinks of it as just a massive, extreme form of repression, pushing terrible memories so far down they're out of conscious reach. The behavioral view suggests that forgetting is actually a learned behavior because it provides relief from anxiety. And then there's the self-hypnosis theory, which proposes that some people might unconsciously hypnotize themselves to forget or distance themselves from the trauma.
Now, as severe as all this sounds, the most important thing to remember is that healing is absolutely possible. So let's talk about what the path to recovery actually looks like.
For stress disorders like PTSD, the goals of therapy are pretty straightforward. First, you want to stop those lingering stress reactions to calm that overactive alarm system down. Second, you help the person gain some perspective on the traumatic memory, so it doesn't have such a powerful grip on them. And ultimately, the main goal is to help them get back to a constructive, meaningful life.
Treating DID, on the other hand, well, it's a lot more complex. It usually happens in stages. First, the therapist just helps the person recognize and accept what's going on and tries to build a trusting relationship with all of the different subpersonalities. Then comes the really hard part, carefully recovering and processing the traumatic memories that caused the split in the first place.
And the final goal, and this is often the most challenging one, is integration. This is the process of gently fusing all those separate personalities back into one single whole identity. It's a long road, but it represents the ultimate form of healing, making the self whole again.
Learning about the incredible and often painful ways the human mind finds to survive isn't just some interesting psychology lesson. This kind of understanding, it's the first step toward compassion, toward breaking down stigma, and toward building a world that actually knows how to support people who've been through trauma.
And that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. If we start to see trauma not as a personal weakness or some kind of character flaw, but as a profound injury, an injury that the mind and body are desperately trying to heal from, how does that completely change the way we think about human resilience?